Mike Romanowski, you've probably heard that under capitalism, people have the right to own property, but that's certainly not true in the case of owning homes. In fact, only 65.8% of Americans own their own homes. In fact, only about 20% of Americans own their homes outright without a mortgage. By comparison, 75% of people in Laos own their own homes. 90% of people in Cuba, China, and Vietnam own their own homes. We don't own our own homes in the USA. We are a bunch of renters, and right now, 10 million people are facing eviction, and 2 million,
11 million,
quote unquote, homeowners are facing foreclosure. What do you think of that?
It fucking sucks. It sucks real bad. America sucks. Capitalism sucks. It's a shitty system.
Leonard, workers' productivity has skyrocketed since the early 70s, but wages have stagnated when adjusted for inflation. Yeah, that's why I'm a communist. Yeah, me too. Communist Grandpas, Thursdays at 8, 7 Central. 1 in 7 Americans rely on food banks before COVID, and that number skyrocketed through the pandemic. 2.5 more Americans die of malnutrition than Cubans, 45 times more than Vietnamese, and even more than twice the Indians. But America controls the international hegemony, and thus we are perceived as wealthy, even though that wealth is trapped by a very small number of millionaires and billionaires. Oh! America's a shithole.
We die more than the Cubans and the Vietnamese and people in developing countries from starvation.
Gee, I wonder what's down here in this hole. Oh, it's my employer. Give me your wages. Why should I give you my wages? Because if you don't, I'll hit you with this hockey stick. But bosses don't steal wages from workers. Oh, that's where you're wrong, eh? Every year, there's 4 times more wage theft than other forms of theft. Just look at this chart here, eh? Oh, would you look at that? I guess wage theft really is a huge problem under capitalism, and we should probably be more concerned with that than things like robbery and burglary and auto theft, but we're not, because we're hegemonically conditioned to believe that employers are trustworthy and workers are more likely to steal from our employers. Yeah, I suppose so, so you'd better hand over those wages before I hit you with this hockey stick, eh? Oh, sorry, boss, I think you misunderstanding the way that this works here. According to this chart you showed me, wage theft usually takes the form of minimum wage violations and overtime violations. There's a lot of rest break and off the clock violations as well, but I don't think usually employers go around with a hockey stick, threatening to beat employers for their wages. I just don't think that's how it works. It's a little bit more dry and boring, which is why people don't pay attention to wage theft in modern society. Oh, you got me there. Shouldn't you be on the clock? Oh, I fucking hate this job.
Hello, and welcome to Beginner's American English. Let's begin. Freedom. Freedom. The USA has freedom.
The United States of America has the highest prison population per capita, with over 25% of prisoners on Earth in prison in the USA.
Democracy. Democracy. The USA has a representative democracy.
Over half of Congress are millionaires. 77% of Congress is white, while only 60% of the population is white. Over $8 billion was spent on congressional elections in 2020, the highest number ever by about $3 billion.
Equality. Equality. Americans are equal.
Just 3 individual Americans own as much wealth as the poorest 50% of people in the USA. The net worth of a typical white family in America is nearly 10 times greater than a typical black family. Before COVID, black people lived about 3 years less than white people, but now, after the pandemic, that gap has nearly doubled.
Hope. Hope. Americans have hope.
51% of young Americans say they feel down, depressed, or hopeless.
Tonight, Ross is getting radical on Friends. You probably didn't know this, but through the pandemic, billionaires have gotten $1.2 trillion richer. I know. Did you know that billionaires pay way less taxes than we do? Yes. Okay. So why don't we have a revolution or something? Because we suck. Oh. Well, I'm gonna have a revolution tomorrow.
The USA has the highest COVID death rate per capita. In fact, it's recently been found that the official death count of COVID-19 in the USA was underreported by almost 60%. The actual death rate should be nearly 1 million. The USA also has one of the highest per capita malnutrition death rates in the world at about 1,900 deaths per million, nearly 4 times the world average. By comparison, Cuba has had 281 deaths per million, Venezuela has had about 129 deaths per million, Vietnam 28, China 3, Laos 0.9.
Billionaires have gotten $1.2 trillion richer during the pandemic.
This is Bear Witness News. I'm Patty Bear. We are led to believe that capitalism has lifted millions out of poverty, but is that true? Of course not. Here's Ted E. Bear with an investigative report on global poverty under capitalism. Ted?
Thank you, Patty. Since 1981, the World Bank has been reporting the number of people living in extreme or absolute poverty, classified as below the international poverty line. Today, the international poverty line is set at $1.90 a day. For decades, the World Bank has been claiming to fight poverty by issuing loans to developing countries and selling on that debt to Wall Street investors with attractive returns of up to 15%. In order to get these loans, debtor countries must agree to IMF structural adjustment, and failure to pay back the loans results in forced sell-offs of public assets and cuts to public spending, pensions, and other social welfare programs. These policies have slowed GDP per capita growth in the developing world from 3.2% in the 1960s and 70s to 0.7% in the 1980s and 1990s. By 2015, these programs have brought half of the world's wealth into the hands of 1% of the world's population. But in the same year, the World Bank reported that the proportion of people in the world living on the equivalent of less than $1.90 per day fell from roughly 4 in 10 in 1990 to less than 1 in 10. If this all seems too good to be true, perhaps that's because it is. The international poverty line of $1.90 per day has been referred to as the minimum amount of income necessary to feed your family. But $1.90 per day is so low that in most countries it would not be sufficient to feed anyone's family. The $1.90 per day figure is based on the average poverty lines of the 15 poorest countries on Earth, including Gambia and Sierra Leone, but it is applied across the planet. Unsurprisingly, this flawed methodology produces absurd results. Pakistan is a case in point. According to the World Bank, Pakistan's efforts to reduce poverty with over $5 billion in World Bank loans have been very successful, with its poverty rate falling from 15.9% of the population to 6.1% between 1996 and 2013. Based on these numbers, it has even been declared that the level of extreme poverty in Pakistan is below 3%. But according to Pakistan's own National Nutrition Survey of 2011, a third of all Pakistani children are underweight, nearly 44% have stunted growth, and half of them are anemic. The level of child and maternity hunger in Pakistan has hardly changed over the last 2 decades, according to a study published in The Lancet in 2013, nor has the situation much improved since then. According to the Global Hunger Index 2016, 22% of the population was undernourished, and 8.1% of children died before the age of 5 due to malnourishment. In India, as of 2015, 300 million were both unemployed and landless. However, World Bank figures showed that in January 2016, less than half of that figure, roughly 145 million people, were considered to be living in extreme poverty. In 2010, the Mexican government reported a poverty rate of 46%. The World Bank set it at 5%. Worldwide, the United Nations has reported that a total of 815 million people suffered from chronic undernourishment lasting over a year in 2016, and that figure is rising. But in 2013, the World Bank reported that only 767 million were classified as living in absolute poverty, and it estimates that in 2016 that figure was even lower. In the words of Karl Marx, there must be something rotten in the very core of a social system which increases its wealth without diminishing its misery. In short, the World Bank reduces poverty by cooking the books. In 2000, the World Bank reported that the number of people living on less than $1.02 a day was actually increasing, and had risen from 1.2 billion in 1987 to 1.5 billion in 2000, and was predicted to reach 1.9 billion by 2015. And yet, just 1 year later, in 2001, the World Bank announced that since 1980, the total number of people in poverty worldwide has fallen by an estimated 200 million. How do they achieve such a rapid turnaround? It's simple. They changed the international poverty line. The World Bank periodically updates the international poverty line, supposedly to factor for inflation. The 2001 poverty line of $1.08 was, in fact, lower in real terms than the previous international poverty line. The poverty headcount changed literally overnight,
overnight, even though nothing had changed in the real world. This happened again in 2015 with the setting of its current international poverty line of $1.90 per day, which is actually lower than the previous $1.25 in real terms. Many economists have argued that a poverty line of $5 a day would be much closer to the real line of people's basic needs. Using this ethical poverty line, it is estimated that the global poverty headcount would stand at about 4.3 billion people, more than 60% of the world's population. Moreover, this figure would represent an increase of over 1 billion people compared to 1990. On this basis, the truth is clear to see. The world has never been richer, and yet there are more people living in poverty today than at any other time in human history. Back to you, Patty.
Wow, Ted, that fucking blows. Now here's Dr. Werner von Baer with a special report about climate change.
Danke, Patty. In regards to global climate change, we're fucked. We're totally fucking fucked. Just look at all the shit that's going down. In capitalism, it's a system predicated on infinite growth and overproduction and greed. It's just not equipped to handle all of this bullshit. Jesus, it's not even just climate change. We've lost 70% of biodiversity since 1970. That's really extremely fucking bad. And now, thanks to capitalist overdevelopment, the Amazon rainforest today is pumping out more carbon than it absorbs. Do you have any idea how fucked that is? We are totally fucked. We're just fucked. Back to you, Patty.
Thanks, Werner. Holy shit, that sucks. It does sound like we're totally fucked.
Capitalism might not be perfect, but it's the best system we have!
The 72 poorest countries on Earth by GDP all have capitalist economies. The USA is number 1 in COVID deaths and jails. Capitalism sounds great in theory, but it always fails. Capitalism always fails. Capitalism always fails.
In the USA, 3 individuals own as much wealth as the poorest 50% of Americans.
WWF, what the world is watching.
What do you have to say about global climate change?
I'm sorry that carbon-based fuels are efficient, they just are. I didn't make it that way. That's just the way things are. And if you're asking a family in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa not to use carbon-based emissions because you are worried about climate change in 100 years, while they are worried about literally their children dying from heat exhaustion, or they are worried about their children dying because they cannot use fossil fuels to power light bulbs, because there have to be energy plants. Right? That is first worldism at its best.
Oh, he has a lot of money. We better listen to what he says.
First of all, this is an old capitalist trick to say that the problems of the world are the problems created by everyone, when in fact they are the problems created by capital. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that as a result, we should talk about the Capitalocene, that historical era dominated by capital. If we look at the centuries between 1450 and 1750, we see an environment-making revolution unprecedented since the Neolithic Revolution, the dawn of the first cities. And that revolution was marked by an increase in the scale and the scope and the speed of environmental change emanating from an Atlantic-centered capitalism that was unrivaled in human history. That large civilizations before had transformed their environment. We can think of massive infrastructure processes and projects, the Great Wall in China, the pyramids, all of that. But this took place, this revolution in landscape transformation and in environment making between 1450 and 1750 was much faster and transformed not just one region of the world, but one region after another, after another, after another. And that it was in these centuries that we saw not just a new dominance of commodity production and exchange in transforming global environments, but we saw new ways of seeing and knowing nature with a capital N. That is, nature became something out there, outside of society, and included many non-whites especially, included many women, many people, many humans, perhaps most humans at the time were excluded from humanity and given over to nature. Why? Because if you could turn nature into a set of objects, you could turn nature into a set of cheap objects. And you could use the cheap labor and food and natural resources and energy of the whole planet to support the project of capital accumulation and industrialization in a broad sense.
Cha-cha-cha-cha! Dance it! Rest period. Splash cool water on your face. Now all around your body. Splash, splash.